of the most interesting aspects of the Game of Thrones and Song of Ice and Fire fandoms is the perception of Tywin Lannister. Tywin largely seems to see himself as an incredibly intelligent, capable, important, and exceptional person. And the fan view of him seems to match up to his sense of self quite directly. He's often considered to be one of the biggest badasses in Westeros, and one of the ultimate masterminds of the Game of Thrones. And he's also seen as a brilliant military strategist and a pragmatic political leader. And it's fascinating, because in reality, this perception seems to be wildly off base, and seems to go directly against what the author was likely trying to say with his character. It's hard to ignore the obvious gender bias that seems to be going on when it comes to the broader fan view of Tywin. Frankly, if any of the female characters did the things that he does, they would be regarded as foolhardy, vain, cruel, and downright idiotic in most instances. But that point of view actually makes considerably more sense than the belief that Tywin Lannister is the most brilliant and brutal man in the Seven Kingdoms. The notion that Tywin is some master tactician is a truly baffling one. Yes, he has defeated his enemies consistently. But truthfully, if the only means that someone has of winning is slaughtering every single person who might stand up against them, then that's not exactly impressive strategy. It could hardly be called strategy at all. The Reynes of Castamere is obviously an ode to the most legendary moment in Tywin Lannister's history, at least prior to the Red Wedding. But that entire incident is actually incredibly informative about him as a person, in a lot of clearly unflattering ways. So it's odd that it's seen as some kind of accomplishment on his resume. Tywin is an interesting character because one of his latent but occasionally very prominent personality traits that has been a present since he was a child is his tendency to overstep his bounds in socially inappropriate ways. For instance, when his sister Jenna was betrothed to a Frey, he speaks out on something that is probably factually correct, and he says that it's a very uneven betrothal that seems to disfavor the Lannisters. But he's still a young child, and publicly criticizing his father's match is incredibly abnormal. Not to mention incredibly ironic, considering who Tywin's ultimate allies would wind up being. However, this is not the last nor the biggest time that Tywin will take things further than he should, or that he's even allowed to. This tendency to go beyond his assigned boundaries clearly rears its ugly head once again, when it comes to the confrontation with the Reynes and the Tarbecks. Yes, both houses are taking advantage of Tytos' weakness, but Tywin was acting out of turn by making demands of these houses at all. And he was taking things to a seemingly exceptional extreme by demanding that they send a hostage in lieu of payment if they couldn't repay the debts that Tywin very abruptly came collecting on, even though he wasn't really in a position to be asking in the first place. When the Tarbecks unsurprisingly deny Tywin's request, and the current lord, Walderin Tarbeck, comes to confront Tytos about what is already an extreme demand that has been made by someone who isn't even the Warden of the West yet, he's taken prisoner by Tywin. Once again, Tywin has elevated tensions to the maximum for no reason other than that he thinks the Lannisters, or rather he himself, is deserving of more respect than these people are giving him, despite the fact that he is literally factually incorrect in this instance. And in response, the Tarbecks take some Lannister hostages as well. When he gets involved, Tytos essentially undoes everything that Tywin has done, exchanging the hostages and forgiving the house's debts. Likely because, to be frank, Tywin doing what he did is actually an outrageous affront to standard protocol. He went so far beyond the bounds of appropriate behavior that it's actually astounding. And he did something to one of Tytos' subjects that was at best an unimaginably shitty social faux pas, and at worst, something that may have actually been illegal for him to do. But Tywin is dissatisfied with this outcome, so he pushes things even further. He bids the Reynes and the Tarbecks to come to Casterly Rock to answer for the supposed crimes that they have committed, despite the fact that everything that they've done has either been a response to Tywin's insanely over-the-top provocations, or a response to what the actual Lord of Casterly Rock, Tytos Lannister, has consented to. Essentially, Tywin is accusing them of false charges of treason because they listened to their actual liege lord instead of him. Understandably, the Reynes and the Tarbecks tell him to politically fuck off and renounce their loyalty to the Lannisters, which leads Tywin to raise an army without his father's permission and sets off the notorious utter demolition of both of their families at his command. It's very interesting to examine this legendary incident in detail, because it actually reflects incredibly poorly upon Tywin, and makes it seem like he was completely unhinged, while the Tarbecks and Reynes were mostly in the right. Yes, they almost certainly took advantage of the fact that Tytos was a weaker ruler, but he was still their ruler, and they deferred to his word over Tywin's just as they should have. Tywin's behavior in this circumstance was just about as extreme as it possibly could have been. And this is how he was willing to act before he even became Lord of Casterly Rock. But what's even grimmer about the entire scenario is that it seems like Tywin was very intentionally provoking them in the hopes that he could get the reaction he wanted, and therefore would have the thinnest excuse to slaughter them all. He pushed them far beyond what any self-respecting house would be willing to accept, even if he had been their actual overlord. And regardless of his father's actual commands, he kept on pushing until he seemingly had the tiniest opening to destroy their entire families. As far as both political and military strategy goes, Tywin's behavior when it came to his most legendary decision was straight up deranged. It's entirely understandable that he scared people into submission, because he breached all standard protocols, escalated the situation to the greatest extreme that he possibly could, and did something that no High Lord of Westeros would do in hardly any circumstance, all before he was even a High Lord. It's not hard to see where Cersei gets her political strategy from, but it's also not hard to see that this is objectively an absolutely terrible, idiotic way of handling problems, or attempting to earn an intimidating reputation. Not to mention, it doesn't exactly take an astounding amount of political acumen to realize that if you treat someone like the dirt on your shoe, they're going to react badly. So the fact that Tywin essentially backed them into a showdown by being repeatedly obnoxiously insulting isn't particularly impressive. This actually puts Tywin's relationship with Aerys in an interesting light as well. One of the main reasons that Aerys was impressed enough by Tywin to make him his hand is because of how brutally Tywin dealt with the Reynes and the Tarbecks, which once again says a great deal about Tywin. If someone like Aerys is charmed by your thirst for violence, then you clearly have anger issues. But there's another valuable insight into their dynamic that can be offered through Tywin's earlier behavior too. Although Aerys was the king, while Tywin was his hand, people would jest that he was the one truly ruling the realm. Aerys unsurprisingly took that very badly, and reacted violently towards anyone who would make the suggestion. But based on Tywin's earlier behavior, Aerys was actually probably in the right for the first and last time in his entire life. Aerys' paranoia was legendary, but if Tywin was comfortable acting out in the way that he did when his father was still Lord and he was merely his heir, then the likelihood that Tywin majorly overstepped the boundaries of what the hand can or cannot do seems almost certain. Much like the Targaryens, Tywin seems to have been born with an enormous sense of entitlement, and he seems to have believed that he was more fit to rule than anyone else from a very early age. But, while he was apparently an effective administrator during his time as hand, his outrageous overreactions and completely unmasked ambition for the Iron Throne's power completely tanked his goals for years. Aerys was known for being mercurial on his best day, so when Tywin made it readily apparent that he wanted to be Westeros's regional manager instead of assistant to the regional manager, it again shows how easily he lets his arrogance and pride get in the way of his own desires. By all accounts, until Aerys started thinking Tywin was getting too big for his britches, they had a good relationship. Had he played his cards right and not tried to outshine Aerys, then Cersei could have ended up on the throne with Rhaegar, and Jaime may have never been accepted into the Kingsguard. But his lack of self-control and inability to rein in his ego nearly cost him both the throne and the heir of his dreams. Again, it's hard to see how Tywin could be considered some master politician when he was put in a position of incredible opportunity, but couldn't even hide his conceit to the point that he went from the king's hand to the bottom of the Westerosi totem pole. Pride is a very interesting thing when it comes to Tywin as well, because he clearly fears humiliation and embarrassment more than anything else. But he also loves using humiliation and embarrassment as a weapon against others. It should come as no great surprise that he would use the most painful thing he could imagine in order to hurt others. But again, anyone with legitimate political acumen would recognize that adding literal insult to injury will make any potential reconciliation in the future exponentially more difficult. Tywin objectively values the ability to hurt his enemies more than he values resolutions to the actual problems, which makes him a genuinely terrible leader. And unsurprisingly, this continues to be a problem for him right up to the very end when he goes to war with the Starks. One thing that immediately jumps out about the way in which he dealt with the Reynes and the Tarbecks is that it was his first legitimate foray into war. And he crushed that rebellion and metaphorically salted the earth where the Reynes and Tarbecks once stood. And of course, it's not hard to see the parallels between these destroyed houses and what Tywin did to the Northmen at the Red Wedding. And similarly, in the events leading up to these massacres, Tywin intentionally provoked his enemies by attacking the Riverlands as soon as conflict was afoot. Although the River Lords were barely involved in the situation at all at that point, Tywin inflicts extreme violence on Catelyn's home because she arrested Tyrion for a crime that she legitimately believed that he may have committed, or at least had a hand in. So again, reacting with over-the-top violence purely because Tywin doesn't think anyone should have the audacity to question him, or any Lannister, is an unfathomably weird and thin-skinned way to take a problem and make it into an exponentially bigger one. It's also very interesting that these incidents parallel each other so clearly, as it says a great deal about Tywin as a person and as a leader, to see that from his first act of martial dominance to his last, he handled everything in the exact same way. He was barely more than a boy when he crushed the Reynes and the Tarbecks, and nearly an old man when he went up against the Starks and Tullys. And in all of that time as a leader and ruler, he learned nothing and likely willfully ignored lessons that would have made him a more effective politician. Specifically, because throwing a tantrum and lashing out at any perceived slight was more important to him than crafting a legacy that would genuinely last. And sure, it's hard to deny that his decisions were effective in the short term. But the fact that a young man who had hardly been in a confrontation before seemingly learned and changed absolutely nothing over an entire lifetime of political maneuvering does not reflect well on Tywin's intelligence or military prowess, as evidenced by the state of the Lannisters now. They won the short-term battle, but are going to lose the war. The Red Wedding will undoubtedly go down as one of the most notorious incidents in Lannister history, but it likely won't be remembered in the way that Tywin wishes it would be. Yes, he killed the king in the north. And yes, he momentarily crushed the rebellion. But let's not forget that the Red Wedding was essentially a Hail Mary pass that Tywin attempted because he was getting outmatched and outfoxed by a naive and inexperienced boy who was barely older than Hannah Montana. That certainly doesn't speak highly of his abilities as a commander. And again, Tywin cares more about image than anything, so he almost certainly wouldn't do anything that would make him look as bad as the Red Wedding does, unless he felt like he had very few options left. But on the other hand, his behavior in the Red Wedding is interesting, both because of his impressive lack of insight and his incredible hypersensitivity. Because he undeniably arranged the slaughter of the Northmen and Rivermen as a flex to make himself look strong. So the fact that he doesn't understand how this action will actually be perceived by most people is weird, and really shows his fundamental misunderstanding of how other people work. Or rather, it shows that he doesn't seem to see other people as actual people in the way that he sees himself. In order to actually ensure his victory, he had to align himself with the least respected and least trustworthy houses in the North and the Riverlands. And he created a scenario where, once again, because of his unfathomable brutality, he would forever be facing rebellions so long as the Lannisters tried to keep control of both of those kingdoms. But he did it anyway, because he cares more about respect, or the fear that he mistakes as respect, than he does about actually getting the job done, or making his life or the lives of everyone in Westeros run a bit more smoothly. But control over the kingdoms is yet another issue where Tywin seems to flounder and make political moves that do not seem beneficial in the long run. And that doesn't just apply to the military actions that he takes in order to force others into submission. Take the marriage between Sansa and Tyrion, for instance. On the surface, Tywin's logic behind forcing his child hostage to wed his son makes some sense. But in the broader context of the political situation in Westeros, it's really a terrible move and shows how obsessed with image and the perception of power Tywin really is. Because after the Red Wedding, there is essentially zero chance that the Northmen will accept anyone with Lannister blood as their ruler, ever. They are so universally loathed that any Lannister who sets foot in the North shouldn't expect to remain breathing for very long. And that obviously applies to Tyrion as well. Theoretically, offering Sansa up as a marriage match to another house, or even to a distantly related family who doesn't bear the surname Lannister, especially when the Lannisters are so wanting for good allies, probably would have been a much more useful move in the long run. It's a bit of a risk because allies can always turn on each other, but given that there is literally no chance that the Lannisters can hold the North, then arranging a marriage that takes the heat off of them, but allows them control of Winterfell in everything but name, likely would have yielded much better results. But as everyone knows, it's all about the family name with Tywin. Because in the end, Sansa's marriage to Tyrion isn't really about political expediency. It's largely about dominance and humiliation. He would rather let the world know that he managed to seize control of a 13-year-old girl with the surname Stark than do what would actually benefit him in the bigger picture. Because he's truly that desperate for the world to perceive him as the baddest dude on the block. And he seems to be so convinced of his own importance that he doesn't seem to acknowledge how easily this could backfire on him, and the rest of the Lannisters. He is both obsessed with intimidating everyone else, but also apparently believes that he has actually achieved that goal so well that no one would ever dare move against him, no matter how horrifically he sinned against them. It's fascinating, because Tywin likely did have it in him to create a lasting legacy for House Lannister, if he just got out of his own way long enough to make that happen. But his belief in his own inherent superiority was so strong and overwhelming that he consistently and willingly dragged himself down, either simply so that he could project the image that he wanted the world to see, or so that he could drag his enemies down with him. But the fact that Tywin genuinely believed that he was going to be able to put a Lannister on the Iron Throne and create a new royal dynasty from his bloodline shows how much insight and intelligence he was truly lacking. Ultimately, the proof is in the pudding. The fact that he thought that he was leaving behind a legacy that would last 1,000 years, when the strength and power of House Lannister collapsed as soon as he did, demonstrates an astounding lack of understanding regarding the political situation in Westeros. And it's pretty poetic that it seems almost guaranteed that the children that Tywin left behind will ultimately be the end of his branch of House Lannister. Ironically, the only political and military abilities that Tywin seemed to have were what he would consider low cunning. He knew how to press people's buttons and could easily predict that people would react badly if he went completely nuclear on them. But his complete inability to empathize or appreciate other people's feelings caused him to make a great number of huge, obvious mistakes that prevented him from succeeding in his goals. And, The very fact that he thought he had won the Iron Throne for House Lannister, and didn't seemingly have the comprehension to realize that the minute that he was gone, House Lannister was going to collapse both from the inside and the out, really demonstrates that his perception was so drastically different from reality that he was basically delusional. In the end, Tywin Lannister was essentially good at administration, terrorizing people into submission, and not much else. But ironically, Tywin's desire to be seen as powerful and intelligent crippled House Lannister far more brutally than his weak and easily manipulated father, Tytos. And Tywin's obsessive desire to rehabilitate the image of House Lannister led to the immediate near decimation of his family and name. But what do you think? Did Tywin actually live up to his reputation? Or did his public image completely mismatch reality? Leave your comments and opinions below. And if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.